This is part 20 of my journey through the Connecticut court system over the last 10 years. At the end of part 19, we were going over all of the things that Matt and the court did that were illegal during the December 29th, 2020 restraining order hearing, which is posted on my YouTube channel, Pro Legal Solutions, for anybody who wants to go listen to it. So during the hearing, Lodice's systematic denial of making threats to Miss Antar constitutes additional perjury. As he testified, "I've never threatened her, I'm not going to threaten her, I'm not going to hurt her," while simultaneously admitting possession of weapons and making statements about his criminal history. His testimony that "I don't have any guns" that she's claiming contradicts his own subsequent admissions about his criminal history involving weapons charges and domestic violence convictions. The transcript reveals Lodice's acknowledgement of multiple arrests for breach of pieces and violation of conditional release, involving domestic violence against his ex-wife, Monica Perez, establishing a pattern of criminal behavior that contradicts his denials of threatening conduct. The false testimony about weapons becomes particularly significant when considered alongside Miss Antar's specific allegations that he claimed to have guns that they don't know about and that there's nothing that the cops can do. Lodice's pattern of alternately denying and then qualifying his statements about weapons possession demonstrates the calculated nature of his deception as he attempted to minimize his threatening conduct while maintaining plausible deniability about specific threats. Lodice's presentation of edited text messages represents sophisticated evidence tampering designed to support his false narrative about consensual contact. Miss Antar's testimony that Matthew actually deleted several of the messages before taking a screenshot and printing it reveals systematic evidence manipulation that constitutes obstruction of justice under Connecticut law. The selective editing of communications to remove context and create false impressions violates both evidentiary rules and criminal statutes prohibiting evidence tampering. The systematic nature of this evidence manipulation demonstrates premeditation and consciousness of wrongdoing, as Lodice carefully curated the documentary evidence to support his false testimony about consensual relations while concealing evidence of stalking and harassment. This evidence tampering, combined with his perjurious testimony, represents a coordinated scheme to defraud the court and deny Miss Antar constitutional protections through criminal means. Judge Murphy's statement that "I don't find either of you very credible," followed by dismissal of the restraining order application, violates equal protection principles by applying an inappropriate burden of proof standard. Connecticut law requires that restraining orders be granted when there is evidence of continuous threat of present physical pain and injury, yet Judge Murphy dismissed the application based on general credibility concerns rather than applying the statutory standard to the evidence presented. The judicial failure to properly weigh evidence demonstrates systematic bias against domestic violence victims, as documented research shows that judges often rely on biases to sort cases as true domestic violence compared with frivolous cases. Judge Murphy's blanket credibility determination ignores the documentary evidence of breaking and entering, the pattern of stalking behavior, and Lodice's criminal history of domestic violence, creating a proceeding that fails to meet due process requirements for fair adjudication. Judge Murphy's application of an improper legal standard violates Connecticut General Statute Section 46B-38A, which defines family violence as an incident resulting in physical harm, bodily injury or assault, or an act of threatened violence that constitutes fear of imminent physical harm. The evidence presented clearly established threatened violence and stalking behavior that satisfies this statutory definition, yet the court failed to apply the appropriate legal framework for family violence determination. The systematic failure to consider the evidence of breaking and entering, stalking, and threatening behavior violates both state statutory requirements and federal due process protections. Connecticut law specifically includes stalking or a pattern of threatening within the definition of family violence, and the evidence presented clearly established both elements. The judicial failure to apply correct legal standards while dismissing legitimate evidence represents a fundamental breakdown of due process procedures. The hearing violated fundamental due process requirements under Matthews versus Eldridge by failing to provide adequate procedural protection for Ms. Antar's constitutional rights. The Supreme Court has established that due process requires consideration of 1, the private interests affected, 2, the risk of erroneous deprivation, and 3, the government's interest in efficient adjudication. Judge Murphy's proceeding failed to satisfy any of these requirements, as she dismissed legitimate evidence while accepting Lodice's perjurious testimony without adequate consideration of the safety interests at stake. The systematic acceptance of manipulated evidence while rejecting documentary proof of criminal conduct violates the fundamental fairness required by the Due Process Clause. Ms. Antar's right to protection from domestic violence represents a significant liberty interest that deserves heightened procedural protection, yet the court's proceeding fell far below constitutional minimums for fair adjudication. The December 29, 2020 hearing demonstrates the systematic escalation of Lodice's criminal conduct from the financial fraud documented in the November 2019 proceedings to physical intimidation and stalking behavior. His November 2019 perjury about income, claiming $13,000 annually when earning over $71,000, established his willingness to commit systematic fraud under oath, while the December 2020 proceedings reveal expansion into stalking, breaking and entering, and criminal threats. This escalation pattern demonstrates the dangerous nature of Lodice's antisocial behavior, as research confirms that financial fraud often precedes more serious violent conduct in domestic violence cases. The progression from economic manipulation to physical intimidation represents a classic escalation pattern that makes Lodice particularly dangerous to Ms. Antar and their child. Lodice's systematic editing of text messages, combined with coordinated perjury, demonstrates sophisticated manipulation tactics designed to deceive the court while avoiding criminal accountability. His careful curation of evidence to support false narratives while concealing incriminating communications represents the type of calculated deception characteristic of antisocial personality disorder. The timing and coordination of Lodice's deception, occurring immediately after his relationship with the teenage daycare worker ended and he began stalking Ms. Antar, reveals strategic manipulation designed to regain control over his victim through legal system abuse. This pattern of using court proceedings to continue harassment represents a classic tactic of sophisticated domestic violence perpetrators. Lodice's successful manipulation of the court system demonstrates his sophisticated understanding of judicial biases and procedural weaknesses in domestic violence proceedings. His strategy of presenting edited evidence while maintaining superficial cooperation exploited the court's failure to properly investigate his claims or apply appropriate legal standards. The success of Lodice's deception in securing dismissal of a legitimate restraining order application demonstrates the dangerous effectiveness of his manipulation tactics and the urgent need for enhanced protections against sophisticated domestic violence perpetrators who exploit system vulnerabilities. The combination of Lodice's perjury and judicial failures created a systematic denial of Ms. Antar's constitutional rights under color of state law, violating 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. The court's acceptance of manipulated evidence while dismissing legitimate documentation of criminal conduct represents the type of arbitrary government action that federal civil rights laws are designed to prevent. The judicial failure to protect Ms. Antar from documented stalking and criminal threats while accepting perjurious testimony creates clear federal civil rights liability under both individual and institutional theories. The systematic nature of these violations demonstrates the need for federal oversight to ensure constitutional compliance in Connecticut's domestic violence proceedings. Follow for the next part to see the rest of why I was completely violated during the 12/29/2020 hearing in New Haven.